I just read the first paragraph. It's flying in.
All right, I think we might go ahead and get started here. So I'm Doug Brake, Telecom Policy Analyst here at ITIF. Thank you all for making it out this morning. We at ITIF focus on public policies that we think will advance innovation and productivity growth, grow the economy at large, and focus on the U.S. and increasingly internationally. And so 5G, of course, is a very important topic. A lot of conversations going on about 5G, what exactly it'll look like, how it'll fit into the broader economy. And of course, that is a global conversation. So wanted to get involved. We put out a report this morning. I hope you all found copies towards the back that sort of highlights our current thinking, the current state of play on the report. But before we dive into that, a few notes of housekeeping. So first of all, there's a survey I'm sure you all found on your seats. We just, a few short weeks ago, had our 10-year anniversary at ITIF. And so what we're trying to do is sort of pull back and evaluate what we're doing right, what we could do better. So we'd appreciate if you all could fill it out. We've got a box in the back. One note, we are trying to avoid duplicates. So if you have seen this survey before, perhaps in an email, perhaps at another event, if you could avoid filling out a second one. That is, of course, unless you are planning on heaping praise on all the telecom policy analysis, then we can print off several dozen extras for you. Excellent. So I think we are having a Twitter sort of conversation going on alongside this. If you want to partake, I think we are using the creative hashtag of simply hashtag 5G, risking some cluttering of the conversation if for more exposure in the broader Twitter sphere, if you will. All right, so by means of format, I'm going to do a brief rundown of our sort of key findings, our key points of the report, do a quick presentation of that, and then we're going to go, I think, just straight down the panel if that works for everyone, starting with Charla on just sort of opening thoughts, either reaction to the paper or just sort of opening thoughts about 5G more generally. And then I'm going to do sort of guided discussion. And then we're hoping to reserve a good amount of time for Q&A, so be ready for that. We did, I hope everyone saw our email, we did end up extending this panel to 11, and so if not, if you'd love to duck out early, if you have meetings, whatever, no worries. So digging into the report, we try to organize it in something kind of a temporal fashion, right? And so start with the present of what are the issues now? What are we sort of running up against with 4G systems, with LTE today, that requires a sort of a new technology, a step change in technology, and advance the next generation. And so we sort of identify three major use cases that would necessitate a sort of change in technology. So the first is enhanced mobile broadband. And so this is sort of how we as consumers interact with mobile networks on a day-to-day basis. There are new technologies that can enable that to be pretty wildly extended by some estimates if all the policies are in place and the environment is right for the investment needed. So this is primarily about adding extra capacity to wireless networks and to a large extent to deal on the consumer side with heavy demand for streaming video. The second sort of big use case that I think is driving a transition to 5G is the massive Internet of Things. And so there are tools within LTE that can address a large-scale IoT deployment to some extent, but there are levels of scalability, especially in signaling, that are a real challenge with current LTE networks. And so there are ways in which a transition to a new sort of 5G network would greatly assist in deploying massive IoT and especially facilitate devices that are low power and low cost with extra long battery life. So the network has to take on some of the functionality to really make a huge scale deployment. possible. So the third sort of use case is what we fall under the rubric of critical communications. And so think public safety, but also sort of really high value industrial automation. If you're doing sort of connectivity in a power plant, or trying to automate mining operations or something like that, that requires extremely reliable, robust communications, low error rate, all of those things. And so particular sectors of the economy that require a new type of network. And so we've got a nice graphic, I think, in the report. It's sort of the 5G triangle, but it's worth noting that different aspects of these use cases make different sense in different markets. And so there are different actors within the ecosystem sort of pulling these in different directions, especially in the standard setting process internationally. And so I think it's worth noting that these are all sort of still in flux. We're exploring the different use cases and trying to make sense where investment makes the most sense. It's also worth noting that there's really still quite a bit of life left in the LTE specification, especially LTE Advanced. And there are a number of functionalities within the specification, and the specification is still being developed within 3GPP. There are new releases that are still coming out the pipe. And so long life left in LTE. It's still sort of, I think fair to say, still sort of in the formative years of 5G, figuring out exactly what it's going to look like. So yeah, moving into the future, I think conversations about 5G tend to get muddled, as there are a number of different technologies that are going to be incorporated into 5G networks. And so people end up talking about particular subsystems. We try to, in the report, pull it out and try to talk about the system as a whole, incorporating all of the sort of component technologies. That said, we pull out three sort of specific building blocks that will be key components to any 5G system. And so the first of that is high band spectrum. And this is where I think most of the conversation, especially in DC, has been about with the FCC's Spectrum Frontiers proceeding. And so these are what are called the millimeter wave bands. It's because the wavelength of these frequencies can be measured in millimeters. And so this is spectrum far higher in frequency than we normally thought possible for mobile broadband use. And there are advances. This brings us sort of to the second sort of technological building block we identify, advances in antenna technology that allow this spectrum to be much more practical for mobile broadband use. So there are still significant limitations when it comes to millimeter wave bands. Very limited propagation, has a hard time making through clutter or trees, significant rain fade. And so extreme levels of infrastructure deployment to get to that sort of last 500 feet or so, where high band spectrum really shines, will require a great deal of investment. The antenna technology, antennas are proportional to the wavelength of the spectrum they operate on. And so when you move way up in the spectrum to those high frequencies with smaller wavelengths, you're able to shrink the antenna way down. And so this enables equipment that uses a larger number of antennas and uses it intelligently to direct the signal to particular user equipment. And so this can make for much larger capacity and much more efficient use of spectrum. A third sort of building block that we identify in the report is higher up. I feel like the sort of lower, the physical layers of the network, I feel like get all the attention, and sometimes we overlook things higher in the stack, if that makes sense. And so we think that this trend towards incorporating more software functionality into the networking itself, here specifically talking about software-defined networking and network functions virtualization, two sort of technologies in tandem, will be really key in sort of bringing all of the system together and bringing it into a coherent whole. So those are three sort of building blocks. There were sort of policy questions around all three, but we at ITF, what we really want to see is to see all of the sort of component technologies coming together in a coherent system. So on policy recommendations front, we sort of think that considering that a lot of the deployment scenarios and use cases are still being, fine-tuned and explored. And the fact that LTE still has a significant amount of gas left in the tank, the government action around 5G at this point should be sort of in the stage setting area. That we're talking about ensure we get millimeter wave spectrum out into the hands of innovators. I think here the FCC has been setting a great example, moving ahead on the spectrum frontier as item, getting spectrum out into the market. This contrasts with other markets, especially ITU has been slow to allocate this portion of spectrum to mobile uses. So step one, get the spectrum out there, get it available to be developing these use cases before the government sort of starts to take a more industrial policy stance or getting extensively involved in the standard setting process. Second, really important policy recommendation is, and this is perhaps a common refrain in broadband policy, but it's really important that we take steps, especially at a local level, to help streamline infrastructure deployment. And so here, not just talking about the equipment siting to actually put small cells, base stations up on buildings, utility poles, things like that, but also a mobile backhaul to get the dark fiber out there to be able to provide backhaul services for all these small cells. So that is the report in a nutshell. I hope you all find copies, and I hope you like it. With that, I'll turn it over to Charla for opening thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Doug, and thanks for allowing me to go first. I was in a panel the other day where I was the last of even more people that are sitting here, and by the time it got to me, there was basically nothing for me to say. I'm with Verizon, and in case you don't know who Verizon is, we're the largest wireless carrier in the United States. We were the first to aggressively deploy 4G LTE in the US, and we have also made clear that we want to take an aggressive stance on 5G. We formed the 5G Technology Forum last year with now amounts to 8 different vendors, including 3 who are sitting at the table here. What Doug had asked us to do is to actually comment on the paper. So I'm going to comment first on that, probably save some of the other things that I would normally say in part of the discussion. So first I have to say that any paper that quotes Joseph Schumpeter is a paper that I want to read. I'm a technology policy person from long ago, but I was a little surprised that you didn't quote his most famous quote of creative destruction, which is of course one of the things that he's well known for. And maybe you just didn't want to speak in cliches. But what I think is interesting about the wireless industry is that from the outside, sometimes people look at this as saying it's a very managed group. It's, there are, because of the nature of the business, there tend to be, large carriers involved in it. And it seems to be, a fairly managed process. But I just want to remind people of just how much the wireless world has changed. If you go back 20 years, it's phenomenal. Even 10 years is pretty amazing. And if you look at how it has affected the telecommunications industry, and I was just writing down a number of things. I mean, long distance doesn't exist anymore, primarily because of the wireless industry. We are seeing, the way people communicate, which is being driven mostly by our children. But, any of you who have children of a certain age, you don't talk to them on the phone anymore, you text with them. That's a technology that was introduced over 20 years ago, but it basically became much more common in the last 10 years. We use them as cameras. Our kids don't wear watches anymore, although they're starting to again because of Fitbit and other things, and Apple. So watches may be coming back in, but we could just go on and on about the number of things. A lot of times when I talk to people, I say, think back about how you use your phone 10 years ago versus how you use it now. And I don't even think I need to go into details. There have been an incredible number of changes. What to me is most fascinating about 5G, and sort of responding to, first to just say that I completely agree with your policy conclusions. I think what the Commission is doing on high band spectrum is fabulous, especially given how short the time it has taken them to get from what was a technological advisory committee recommendation is it less than 2 years ago, or is it about 2.5, 3 years ago?
October 2014.
2014 was the NOI, and then NPRM, and in a few short weeks they're actually going to be. We know they'll be allocating spectrum for in the high bands for for 5G. We tend to talk about it in that terms, but they talk about it in terms of flexible use, which is a policy that they have had on the table for over 20 years at this point, and it is a critical policy in the United States that allows us to move forward the way we do. We don't have to ask permission. Even looking back at things like the AWS-1 spectrum, everybody said that that was 3G spectrum, except in this country. Around the rest of the world, it was 3G spectrum. Well, we actually launched 4G for the first time on that, and didn't have to ask permission, didn't have to say, can we use this technology? As long as we operated within the technical constraints, it was good. So it's a very important policy, and the commission has made clear, what they're doing is they talk about it in terms of 5G, but they make clear that what they're offering is flexible use of this spectrum, which will allow, fixed mobility and, allow us to, as operators and new entrants, to move forward. But the transition to 5G, first off, I think it's an important point to be made, and I'm sure that some of the folks at this table will talk about it a little bit more, that there is an amazing amount of life left in 4G. One of the stories I tell is that there are some people in our network planning division who typically are the ones who do the next generation. It is typically it is an air interface generational switch. And this time, because there is so much life left in 4G, that the people who are doing 4G couldn't actually take on 5G, and we actually had to separate it out. So for the first time since I've been with the company, the guy who has always been the network planning guy doing the next generation technology is still dealing with 4G because there is just so much going on there. So what does that mean? And also 5G, again, those of us who've been around here a long time, you always think air interface, but that's, that'll clearly be a portion of this, but it's also, I just look at it, and one of the things I wrote down is it's just going to be messier, because it isn't just this transition from 4G to 5G. It's going to be a transition. 4G was a very interesting transition because it really was a transition from, into IP networks. But this is going to be networks of networks. It's going to be a lot of different spectrum. And in fact, to the extent I have one little thing where you talked about, this is going to be, I can't even remember what it was, but something about the operators. It's, licensed spectrum. It's, Wi-Fi is going to be more important, other unlicensed use of spectrum. Well, we're already doing that. And when we do solutions for companies, it's not that or utilities or, cities, we don't go in and say, well, you have to use all licensed spectrum. What we do is we go, what's the best way to get you what you need to do? And this, to me, is going to be the epitome of 5G. That along with all the rest of the things we talked about, high bandwidth, low latency, IoT. So, again, sometimes the paper talks about cellular operators. Well, to the extent that cellular type systems are still fundamentally the approach that the wireless operators take, which is, spectrum reuse. It was an incredible concept in the 1940s when it first was invented. We didn't quite get the hang of it until the 1980s, but it is a way to use spectrum more efficiently. And to Doug's point in the paper, what is going to make that work in a 5G world is densification of networks. But that densification is going on now. And for example, we just announced a couple of months ago that we're working with the city of Boston in a lot of different ways, not just on the wireless side, but also wireline. Well, a component of this is going to be, better access to, places where we can put smaller cells. And, it really is the only way it's going to work. And I completely agree with the conclusion here that it's going to take a lot of, work with local governments. And, the FCC is doing, everything it can within the context of its regulatory construct, but it really is a matter of working closely with cities and, even in some cases states, municipalities. It is a more expensive operation, but thanks to, some of the people at this table, the cell sites are getting smaller and smaller. They're, sizes of fire alarms or, little discs. But still, the fundamental concept of reuse is what will apply here. And so you do have to, you have to have a lot of them. So I also liked the quote about allowing competition to drive discovery of new technology. And I do think that is absolutely fundamental to the way things are done in the United States. And again, it's what has driven us in large part to take an aggressive stance in 5G. It's, we look at it and we go, what does the consumer want? Where do we need to go? Clearly, we need to figure out a way to get more bandwidth, better latency, all of these things done. So therefore, we need to kind of pull together and figure out a way to drive the process and drive toward standards. So the only sort of funny little thing I will say about the paper, and then I'll finish and move it on, let others talk about it, is to a certain degree, I felt a little bit like it's not exactly burying the lead, but I would make notes like, seems to separate IoT from video. And then the last paragraph would be, IoT is, increasingly about video. So it was things like that. I'd be, spectrum traditionally, very costly. And then you went on to say, but actually infrastructure is a huge portion of the cost of what we do. So, it was it's just a funny little comment. I'm like, well, what about? And then I go, oh, okay, he's got it here. So, in any event, thank you, Doug. I think it's a good paper, and I move on to Tom.
Thank you, Sheldon.
I'm Tom Mao. I'm with ZT USA, and we are located in Dallas, Texas. ZT USA is a telecom service and solution providers worldwide. In US, we are the number 4 handsets terminal providers. In terms of the comments on this paper, I want to give a little different approach. As we all know, 5G probably is down the road next 4 or 5 years away. But there are certain technologies today available for 4Gs. Okay, those technologies will be useful for 5Gs for sure. For example, one is the massive antenna technology, like Doug mentioned. One of them is the massive MIMOs. Massive MIMO, for example, for today we have employed more than 128 antenna elements in one single antenna redoms that can produce very high throughput, like 5 times more than the current throughput. For our companies, ZTE was awarded 2 prestigious awards in this year's Barcelona Mobile World Congress to receive the awards for 2 massive MIMO technologies. Yeah, another area I want to comment is this software, SDN, software-defined networks. This is definitely the technology for the 5Gs. But today, for 4Gs, for example, we have we call the VEPC. EPC is the technology, is the core network for LTEs. We have the virtualized EPC already, 100% virtualized on the 2 billion on the standard servers, so which is projected for 5G also. It's available today for 4Gs. Next one is high band spectrums. We have conducted, I think a lot of vendors have conducted trials already. For us, we have conducted a trial in the middle of the last year for these 28 gigahertz bands in Shanghai. That we have verified a lot of properties for these high band frequencies. So for all those technologies that will be projected available for 5Gs, one of them is the major one is the air interface, like Charlotte has mentioned. This air interface for 5G definitely will be redefined in the standard committees, but certain technologies, like I mentioned, antenna technologies, especially like the massive MIMOs, and also the software-defined networks, those are available today for even 4G technology, LTEs. Thank you.
Sure. First off, I agree with most everything that was said so far. I would just add that in addition to the emphasis on new capabilities, the demand for data is just continuing to surprise. Ericsson just released a study May of this year showing that the mobile wireless demand was on the order of 282 petabytes, which is one with 15 zeros behind it in 2010. 2015, that it moved up to 5,000. And by 2021, they're predicting that to be 50,000 petabytes. So it sort of puts all of this in context. And the point I want to emphasize is the public policy, spectrum policy component of all of this. We're going to need low, medium, and high spectrum, not just for capacity, but because of the differences in capabilities. Low frequencies for the wide area of narrow band applications, and at the millimeter wave, the high bandwidth, low latency approaches. It's no secret that the results of the WRC 15 were disappointing in terms of freeing up or proposing additional bands for this kind of use. But the good news is that many of the leading mobile countries, we call them rabbit countries, are keen to lead. And what's interesting, and it's been the case now for a couple of years, is that a lot of countries are saying, we're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on public-private partnerships to promote 5G. That isn't going to happen in the US. But what is going to happen, what Charla alluded to, is we're going to get spectrum in the marketplace in a flexible way incredibly quickly. When we were thinking about this a couple of years ago, we were hoping that the Commission would get to where it's going to be in July, about a year from now. So I've often been recorded as saying critical things of government and the FCC. Let me say here, this is one of the most astounding efforts, and I really give high praise to Chairman Wheeler for doing all this, because at the end of the day, the U.S. is going to lead, and the reason is because of the FCC. And just drilling down a little bit on this, the chairman's already basically, spoiler alert, said that the 28 gigahertz, the 37, most of the 37 to 40 gigahertz was going to be licensed, and licensed flexibly. So that means the folks who already have licenses will have assignments. And that's a crucial point, because more than 3 years before the WRC 19 starts, the US will have effectively allocated and assigned much of the 28 and 39 gigahertz spectrum. And I predict, because of how quickly things are moving at 28, we're going to see the 37 to 40 that's licensed get in the marketplace very quickly. The other thing that's crucial is that the 64 to 71 gigahertz is going to be made available on an unlicensed basis. We were a little bit different than some of our friends in the mobile ecosystem. We thought that should be unlicensed. I think for my friends in the public interest community, they are getting 7 of the 10 gigahertz for unlicensed. That's a huge victory for unlicensed. We're very happy with that. And then the last thought I'll leave you with is that hopefully, and I think it's largely true, the Commission is going to do the other important thing here, which is to make these licenses available in a very flexible, investment-friendly way. There'll be long-term licenses and reasonable technical limits. Hopefully the performance requirements won't be unreasonable. And I think, again, to end on a positive note, that's going to be the key to success here, because the U.S. government is not going to spend those hundreds of millions of dollars, but the companies at this table and a lot of others around the world are going to, and they'll be doing it in the U.S. first because they're going to have the opportunity and a lower risk investment environment.
First comment, I guess, I fully agree with Charlotte. It's getting tougher and tougher to find new items to talk about. Farther down the road. So,
I succeeded.
but I fully agree with many of the comments already been said. I'll try to tick through some of the items on the paper. First on the 5G triangle, I think, yeah, we agree. I think those are the key points: massive IoT, enhanced broadband. critical communications, but we kind of see it a little bit broader that IoT actually covers all of these things. It's just not IoT for a large number of connections with low power. It's going to actually be enhanced broadband through video connections, maybe connect every video post within the city for that's going to require high data rate. Critical communications could also use that in IoT sense. For example, let's say you put a robotic surgeon in every car and there's an accident, it pops right out, does surgery through telepresence, for example. So, I mean, it could be a very broad critical communications aspect of IoT. As part of that IoT, we have announced with Intel an IoT strategy dialogue where we're going to try to build the policy framework here going forward for the U.S. within under the ITI. So hopefully we'll move that ball forward here pretty soon. Hitting on the key building blocks, high band spectrum. Fully agree, high band spectrum is very important. Samsung's been doing research on this for many years. In 2013, we did a gigabit per second. In 2014, we announced that we were doing 1.5 gigabits per second at 110 kilometers an hour, about 68 miles per hour in a mobile sense from a single base station. Just in March, we announced we're doing handovers at 1.6 gigabits per second in a mobile environment, about 25 kilometers per hour, 60 miles per hour. And just yesterday, we announced some new technology that we're coming out. We're putting antennas, embedded antennas in cases that have dozens of elements that are less than 1 millimeter thick. We also made efficiency gains in power amplifiers. Our latest power amplifier will more than double the output. Also, will double the efficiency of the device. So we're getting close to where you can put these things in handsets. So I think the technology is continuing to grow and advance at a very, very rapid pace. Meet the U.S. plans, the plans in Korea for the Olympics, and the plans in Japan for the Olympics. Closing note, I fully agree with everything Peter said. I think the FCC has done a great job here in leading the U.S. forward on opening the bands, particularly 28, 37 to 40 gigahertz, even the 64 to 71. They balance multiple needs here from a large, diverse range of companies, and I think the FCC, from what I understand, has put a very reasonable framework going forward to allow multiple parties to grow.
Okay, so I feel a little bit like the 18th person to give a toast at a wedding, so let's see what I can do here. If anyone came for a contentious, bitter panel here, I'm sorry, you're going to be disappointed. So Qualcomm, we're very, very excited about 5G, working on all cylinders to drive it forward, working with partners, some of whom are around the table, not just in the United States, but around the world. I hope that if you came this morning and you didn't know what 5G is, that it will be so pervasive in a couple of years, you'll look back on today, June 30th, 2016, and think that was the day I first heard about that, and wow, it's now out there and everywhere. And again, not just in the United States, but around the world. We do, 5G will be something that requires low band, mid band, and high band spectrum. It was fabulous to hear Chairman Wheeler in his speech lay that out so clearly. Regulators around the world also see that. On our end at Qualcomm, we've had prototypes in the 28 gigahertz band, one of the key millimeter wave bands, for quite a while now. And just this week, we announced prototypes for 5G in the sub 6 gigahertz range, because again, that will be an important part of 5G. And again, as well, 5G will entail licensed spectrum largely, but it will also entail shared spectrum and unlicensed spectrum. We agreed, we are working now already in the 60 gigahertz band and are excited to see more unlicensed spectrum there. Another important part of 5G that hasn't, that Doug touched upon in the paper but hasn't been really addressed so far in the panel, is the standardization process. 3GPP is working hard on that. I know our folks working with, again, partners around the world are doing everything we can to see that process accelerated. It's always somewhat of a chaotic / interesting process because so many companies around the world have so many different ideas for 5G. There's commonalities, but there are always differences, and there always are different folks who want to go ahead in advance, and then usually there's efforts to then fold the learnings from early deployments actually into the standard. That's been key for LTE. For LTE, we're on our 7th version of LTE now, and we would anticipate the same kind of process for 5G. So I think borrowing a line from famous basketball coach Johnny Wooden, I would say be quick but don't hurry. So the idea is to accelerate things, work with regulators and fellow vendors and operators around the world, because economies of scale are so important, and because, by the way, another aspect of this that hasn't been mentioned is we should not just assume that capital investment is like rain. Billions and billions of dollars of investment is going to be required for 5G. We need a global economic environment that fosters that, and we shouldn't just that just doesn't happen by accident. That's something that needs to be a focus, obviously not just for 5G, but for for the global economy. So a quick way to think about 5G, I'll just end on that, is if you think of 3G and 4G as connecting people to the internet, phones, first flip phones, then smartphones, to one another, you can really think of 5G as connecting everything. So, LTE is going to absolutely continue. I totally agree with that. And we have this funny dynamic inside Qualcomm where whenever anyone thinks of a use case in one of these deep verticals, whether it's drones, cars, Internet of any aspect of the Internet of Things, mission critical communications, think of that as a 5G use case. Those are also things we're working on for LTE as well. However, 5G will be revolutionary at the end of the day, I think, and we're absolutely focused on it like a laser beam, and look forward to working with partners and regulators around the world. And I'll just end on this: is in an era when everything is partisan, not just at the FCC, but writ large in the United States, writ large around the world, it is really gratifying to see spectrum policy for 5G be bipartisan. So fabulous speech by Chairman Wheeler, equally fabulous speech by Commissioner O'Reilly. And I don't want to jinx anything for the July FCC meeting, but I'm hoping that there's a strong bipartisan consensus around 5G here in the United States, and I would like to see that around the world. So I'll end on that.
Wonderful. Great. So I'll start off with something, I guess, something with softball, but I'm curious to get everyone's thoughts, or whoever can jump in on this. So Dean, you mentioned the investment factor, and sort of looking at the use cases that 5G, where 5G holds the most promise, where investment makes the most sense. Sort of what do you think, where are the areas where 5G holds the most promise over 4G? Where should the focus be? Thinking of sort of like the 5G triangle we talked about, where is it that excites you the most?
Okay, so yeah, this time I'll get to start. Wow, that's really cool.
Seems fair.
So here's the thing. I think everyone knows this, but I think it's, you have to answer a question like that with such humility because of the fact that, when folks were inventing 5G at Qualcomm and Samsung and Verizon around the table, no one imagined Uber. No one imagined Snapchat. No one imagined, 1,000 different apps and different uses of LTE that are now, highly, highly successful and that support, billions and billions of dollars of revenue. So, the good thing is we don't know. And hopefully the idea is to develop a technology that has so much to it that it can support all kinds of different people working in garages with use cases that we could never imagine. I mean, the ones that obviously get a lot of attention are the things that I've mentioned, where there's ultra low latency, ultra high, ultra fast connectivity. So, a surgeon conducting an operation remotely, wirelessly, using robots, you can think of that for, that's just a kind of way to think of it. But whether it's, medical uses, smart cities type uses, industrial internet, things that today are unimaginable. In fact, what I would say about 5G is, with 4G and 3G, we just invented the technology, and really, I think there was almost no attention to uses. We just said, let's invent the best, coolest wireless technology we can, and we'll see where it goes. And what's interesting with 5G is actually people are focused on your question, Doug, and people are actually thinking now about uses, and that's actually rare in the industry.
Anyone else?
Just a couple of comments. One thing, this is kind of an old example, but I like using it in this context in another industry, is when ATMs were first being considered by banks, the use case for them was shift workers, that rarity of dual career families. And basically within a very short period of time, what happened is nobody used a teller anymore. They would just go to the outside ATM. The banking industry had no clue that that was going to happen. And I think, that's one example, but there are some great books that give you multiple examples, in our industry, the famous McKinsey report that said there'd be, 100,000 customers by the year 2000. So, I just think that to echo what Dean was saying, I think it's important to understand that we don't in some ways know what the future, we definitely don't know what the future holds, but we really, we're trying to make sure that we have a very robust ecosystem. One of the things that Verizon did as part of the 4G LTE launch is we actually recognized that very early on, is that since we were going to be one of the leading deployers of this technology, we wanted to make sure that other parts of the industry had an opportunity to actually hands-on play with the technology. So we actually created a couple of innovation centers where small businesses, large businesses, business could come in and actually get their hands on LTE networks and try and figure out how do you make it work, how do you actually develop products for it. And that's actually going to be a very important component of, I think, of 5G, is to have that kind of opportunity. It's one of the things that we're going to be doing. And in this case, it even will precede, and when we did it for LTE, it was after the first standards had been adopted. But to your point, Dean, that you made, is that the standard process has been very dynamic in LTE with several versions, and it continues to grow. And we want to see sort of the use cases sort of feed into the standards process, but also have it, just a very dynamic interaction, very, humanitarian, if you will, or alien, or whatever you want to call it, so that the whole thing just is this cycle where you actually have use cases feeding into standards and then the standards feeding back in. And so I actually think it's extremely important to have that kind of sandbox mentality with respect to all of our, standards development, but 5G in particular.
One brief addition, I agree with what was said, but I think it's important when you're thinking about high-tech markets to recognize the bandwagon effects. We've been alluding to it. Great book, highly recommended, Jeff Rolfe's The Bandwagon Effect. If you think about the PC market, hardware, software, CDs, DVDs, VCRs, color TV, you see this phenomenon where there are strong complementarities. And I think that's what we're talking about here, and we'll be surprised what they are, but once they take off, then the demand curve actually bends backwards. And as more and more tapes were available for rental, the value proposition for the VCR went up and the demand shot forward. And I think we're going to see this in spades in 5G.
So I'm curious about what the transition from 4G to 5G is going to look like. Are there significant hurdles in making that transition? Tom, you made it sound like there are significant aspects to 4G that have already incorporated a lot of the 5G technology. How will we know when we have 5G? Will it simply be that we're seeing advertisements on TV for 5G handsets, or what does the transition look like?
We are seeing this transition from 4G to 5G will be much more gradual stage, and also maybe deliberate just because the 4G still has a lot of gas in the tank. And we see the 5G will have also take some time to be fully developed, especially because the use cases are so large and so broad. So I think overall, we think the transition from 4G to 5G will be a gradual steps.
Anyone else?
Yeah, sure. It's really hard to predict that. Quite frankly, there's going to be a marketing play when you're seeing people advertising 5G. I've been in Korea where I've seen already in the shops 5G phones listed. But to get away from marketing, I think there's going to be a huge demand for mobile data. And we're doing great things with LTE, dual carrier uplink, dual carrier downlink, to really extend that and try to meet these demands. But we have a limited amount of spectrum to do this currently. So really, we got to go into new bands and move pretty quickly to that. And, maybe Charlie can talk about it, but Verizon is very, very aggressive on moving forward in near term with deploying technology here. So I think once people get a flavor and get used to what they're seeing here, what essentially is going to be a desktop wired environment and the mobile environment, I think it's going to be a huge growth in the ecosystem.
Yeah, also what I would add is I think it's really important not to think of 5G as smartphones, as just smartphones, or even as smartphone centric. So, no one knows what are going to be the first actual 5G devices, but, it will be all kinds of things with that will all of a sudden have, tremendous connectivity, wide area, low latency, very, very ultra fast connectivity. And in fact, I think that is one of the things about 5G is it may not be a smartphone thing in its early days at all. Hopefully we won't go through the same, and we're sort of already going through it, but hopefully we won't have the same thing that we've done before about, different technologies being called 3G, and then we had all kinds of stuff about what 4G was. And so, hopefully it'll be more like Potter Stewart said, we'll all know it when we see it. But, I do think that it will be pervasive, it will be in lots of different things, and there will probably be multiple flavors of it within a standard, just the way there are within LTE. So there may be, I think there's work on a version of it that has an LTE anchor and that has 5G on top, in addition to that, and also a version that is maybe more 5G standalone-ish. But I think the way likely it will be, when the transition will occur, obviously we got to see that, play out.
Great. So I kind of want to transition and dig in a little bit more specifically into the FCC's Spectrum Frontiers proceeding. So obviously this is the FCC's effort to get this high band millimeter wave spectrum out into the market. Sounds like general agreement that this has been a success story, that FCC is looking to, has circulated an order looking in July to put out almost 11 gigahertz of spectrum to be allocated. But I'm curious, so what are sort of the issues? What has been at play within the Spectrum Frontiers proceeding? Any more specifics on how you're happy to see it shake out? I'm specifically curious how the sharing with satellites is going to be resolved. Anyone want to?
Well, let me start, because what I want to do is compliment several people at the table. The chairman of the FCC several months ago, right after, I think it was right around the close of the when the reply comments came in on the NPRM, sort of issued just said, look, the satellite industry and the wireless industry need to talk about how they're going to share, because I think a lot of people in the room probably know this, but just so you have a sense of the background here, is that in particular, I'm going to focus a little bit on the 28 gigahertz band in particular, because as Peter mentioned earlier, the 28 gigahertz band was in play at the last World Radio Conference in November as being one that would be studied at the next World Radio Conference for mobile broadband. And what happened is, as a result of efforts on the part of probably, I can legitimately say the satellite community, that the satellite community has operations in those bands, they were able to get that pulled off the table. The FCC made it clear that they were not going to do that, and that it was up to us to work with the satellite community to come up with ways to share the spectrum. And, it became very much an engineering exercise where the satellite engineers and the wireless company engineers sat at a table and really, talked about each other's systems. And ultimately, we both provided input into the FCC. And, the FCC, I think, appears to be making some choices about, allowing the satellite industry to grow in that band, even though they have secondary rights, as opposed to what Peter was talking about before, the incumbent licensees having primary rights in that band, but still allowing there to be some growth and protected growth. And while we would have preferred in the 28 gigahertz band that they didn't quite allow as many satellite gateways as they appear to be going to allow. The draft is going to permit one per count, grandfather all the existing, and permit one per license area, and the license areas are fairly small. They're a county basis in the draft proposal, and all of this is available in the fact sheets that the commission has put out on this in the chairman's proposal. And so that, to those of you who don't know these sort of statistics, there are 3,200 counties in the United States. Right now, there are about 40 satellite gateways, so that allows, a factor practically in growth and the satellite systems. We would have preferred there were not quite as many of that. I'm sure the satellite community would vote. Nobody's here to defend their point of view. I know they wanted co-primary access and wanted more access. But frankly, I look at it and I think, well, both parties are, more or less unhappy, so the commission must have done something right in that regard. And that, there are several issues like that throughout that the commission was really balancing an unbelievable number of things. I mean, licensed and unlicensed, federal and non-federal, satellite and terrestrial use. And they've, in my view, the chairman and staff, I have to, the chairman has done a fabulous job, but the staff has been working like crazy to get these things done in a very technical proceeding. And they are really trying to get as many things settled in this order as is possible. So anyway, this is a little bit of a convoluted way, but I actually feel like, like I said, we would have preferred the commission didn't quite do what they appear to be willing to do, but it looks like, they've had a tough decision and they really are balancing where they've come out. So,
yeah, I would say the compromise is reasonable. Hopefully, those new uplinks at 28 in counties are not in densely populated areas. I think the commission essentially got it right in the MPRM. They said the FSS, the fixed satellite service uplinks, were secondary at 28. They, of course, can use technology and firms and negotiate with the new licensee. That's a bottom-up, decentralized way to balance a very complicated situation that would vary place to place. And fundamentally, I hope that's where they still are. I recognize compromises are necessary, but at the end of the day, if the commission does a good job of delineating the rights and allows the satellite folks to negotiate, there's no reason why we should believe an efficient outcome would occur, and if satellite is efficient, it'll occur. One last quick thing about this that I mentioned how great it is from a U.S. standpoint that the commission has moved forward on spectrum. It's also great internationally. Rob, I think, was alluding to this. We're seeing Korea, Japan, even China now looking at trials. And I think the world's looking at the fact that the commission is moving so quickly on both allocation and assignment and saying, we've got to do more as well. So the repercussions, positive repercussions of this decision are highly significant.
Just to build on what Charlotte said, and the satellite operations to date, I mean, they've been there almost 15 years, have over 40 or so stations. What the FCC is doing in this decision is going to give them an order of magnitude, or two orders of magnitude, capability to deploy. So I think they have a path forward. As far as the impact to the 5G deployments, as long as they're kept in areas where we don't expect to have 5G, rural areas, low population areas, not along major highways and major events, the way these Earth stations operate, they're very large Earth terminals, so they don't radiate power very high towards the horizon, so the 5G systems can actually build around them. And then I think that's the FCC's thinking about the impact from satellite terminals into the 5G systems. As far as the other side of the coin, the interference from 5G into the satellite systems, you've got to remember you can't worst case the analysis when you look at these things. You have to take into account how these things operated. These beams are going to be phased array beams. Are going to be looking, over here at John Godfrey, for example. He's doing 5G. We're going to send a beam to him. We're not going to send a beam up to a satellite system. We're going to have some discrimination there. All these factors are very important when you look at this. I fully agree with the analysis that was put on the record and say we don't expect to see an interference situation here or interference to the satellite outposts.
So a couple of you already stole my thunder on the next question. I was going to ask more to spell out more on the WRC process, but it sounds like we kind of covered that. Unless anyone else has anything else to add, any more color on
The only thing I would add to that, and again, this is the U.S. system. We have done this many times before, where we actually go and do things that are at odds with what the rest of the world does, and we can kind of create some chaos. But the one thing that I think is very important to remember about this is this WRC, where people were, at a consensus agreed not to put 28 gigahertz on the table, which is the band that we, as was mentioned earlier, that we and others in our industry are going to aggressively deploy in, was also the same WRC that agreed to, on a worldwide basis, adopt 700 megahertz as of an area for mobile. In the United States, we auctioned that spectrum in 2008 and deployed in 2010. Now the rest of the world is doing what we've already done. So my view is that same thing is going to happen here. And so that's the only color I would add. It's sort of just an indication of, how things, work sometimes in the international world. So.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is, on the technology end, we're going to do everything we can to support 5G in low, mid, and high bands. We're already doing that, and it would be great. It would be nirvana to have perfect global harmonization. Obviously, we have the total antithesis of that in LTE, where we have to support more than 40 spectrum bands in these phones, which is quite a challenge. I think we won't see anything nearly that difficult and complex for 5G, but again, we're already working with 5G below 6 gigahertz and at 28, and so we'll do everything we can technologically to drive economies of scale and to support the bands that are under consideration all around the world. And to the extent that there is some harmonization, that's obviously better than if there were none, but we'll do everything we can to enable the devices to operate across the widest swaths possible.
Which is why we're comfortable moving forward with 28 gigahertz.
Yeah, this also reminded me the situation 5 years ago when the US auctioned 700 bands, which is the US versions. And as of today, US 700 band is still the only band available in US. In the other part of the world globally, we all use the APT, the Asia Pacific 700 bands. So I think this success is very significant even for the high band also.
Sticking with the sort of international question, I'm curious a little bit more about the standard setting process. It seems like a lot of focus on 3GPP so far on the panel, but I'm curious thoughts on other standards bodies. It seems like the European Union standing up the 5G public-private partnership is working on developing a number of standards, trying to feed those into the ITU's IMT 2020 process. I'm curious for any thoughts on where the ITU sits in this whole picture, if it's purely focused on 3GPP, or if there's concern about other sort of, I don't know if it's fair to characterize this as perhaps rogue standardizing bodies, sort of trying to feed standards into the ITU, or is it purely 3GPP?
I guess I'll give it a shot. I'm sure other folks would want to comment on that. So I do think 3GPP is the main focus of activity for standardizing 5G, and there's so much activity and interest in 5G and 3GPP that I was saying the other day that they're going to have to find a bigger venue for their meetings. And in fact, the people who go to the meetings aren't going to have tables like they normally have, probably. So, I mean, there's a huge amount of activity, and that just reflects the fact that there's so many companies in so many different countries with different ideas about 5G. I don't think that the European Commission means in any way. The European Commission wants to see strong standardization, and I don't think that they're in any way pushing back against 3GPP or anything like that. I don't think that's what. In fact, just the opposite. I think they are strong believers in standards, understand the benefits of economies of scale in terms of standardization and in terms of spectrum and harmonization. So it is always an interesting process, a very complex process, as I say, so many different players and so many different ideas, but I think it's moving ahead strongly and well so far.
The other standards environment is obviously probably IEEE. I mean, they're going to be defining probably what's going to happen in the 64 to 71 when they extend their current lower frequencies.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, and I think it's an important point, and the chairman emphasized this as well. Given that we have 57 to 64 gigahertz already available on an unlicensed basis, there could be 14 gigahertz of spectrum, 57 to 71. I think I got the arithmetic right. Available. So that is going to be a very attractive band for IEEE to look at for unlicensed use.
And the IEEE already has a standard for the lower part of that Y-gig.
Y-gig.
Both Intel and Qualcomm
Yes, exactly.
are moving ahead with that, and they're actually going to, I think each of us have our chips and devices that you'll see that provide unbelievable connectivity.
So I'm curious, transition from that, with the Y-gig standard, it seems like given the tremendous amount of spectrum available for unlicensed, they're looking at standardization by IEEE, looking at unlicensed. How will this broad swath of unlicensed spectrum affect broadband competition? Do you all expect potential new entrants relying on that unlicensed spectrum, or is that just going to be a component that is fed into other mobile ecosystems? I guess, generally speaking, how do you expect 5G to impact broadband competition?
Well, I guess
Please.
I mean, 5G, as I said at the beginning, it will have this important unlicensed component to it, and that's important both for existing players in the wireless business and new entrants to the wireless business. And by the way, it's not clear that the only part of 5G that's unlicensed is this additional 64 to 71 gigahertz. I think there are other aspects of unlicensed that probably will come into play for unlicensed. And I think that, again, I think the way that plays out in business models, that's the fun part, remains to be seen, who knows. But whether that there are, greenfield unlicensed players, I think it's probably too hard to say right now for sure. But, it's a fact, unlicensed spectrum is an important part of mobile broadband today, and it will only be even more important in 5G.
I would say that it's going to enhance competition, but the way I think about competition is not just in terms of allocative efficiency, our price is close to cost, but how much innovation is occurring. what's happening to cost, how many new services are involved in it. If you think of competition as that kind of a discovery process, as opposed to some narrow prices close to cost process, then competition is going to be enhanced tremendously, and consumers are going to benefit, societies are going to benefit enormously. One last thing on competition, to the extent that people think about sub-markets here and they think about licensed spectrum in the millimeter area, I do hope that the commission does make as much of the 37 to 40 gigahertz available on a licensed basis, because that'll obviate that problem. Because if people start fixating on, oh, how much does one person have of 28, how much, if you have the 37 to 40, then we'll have 4 gigahertz of spectrum essentially available with multiple opportunities for licensed operators there. And that's not only going to enhance competition, it's going to solve a lot of regulatory problems.
So I want to check here real quick. I know Dean may have to duck out early for a meeting, and so I want to turn over and see if there are any questions from the audience, any burning questions. And please, if we've got a microphone, that if you can identify yourself for the stream, we'd appreciate it.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Femi Akibi. I'm a development consultant here in the US, and actually my interest is in the African continent. What are the possibilities of all these technologies in area of ID, finance, data transfer that could connect the new framework, i.e. blockchain and other platforms that are coming with these 5G mobile possibilities? And to Mr. Tom, any new technology in the area of external antenna that will control besides the ugliness of it on the street?
You want to take it? Yeah, international.
Yeah, you have raised a good question. Actually, companies like ZT, we have invested a lot in the Africa continentals. I have been in Africa several times already by myself. One thing we have done is we try to, for example, is the energy efficiency with the solar panels, gas generators for the cell sites, where the cell sites does not have the energy available. And I think these things will be continued, for 5Gs, just to adapt to the African continentals.
Anyone else?
I mean, in general, just, I think 5G, again, it'll be a global phenomenon, and I think it offers tremendous potential for Africa, just the way it does for other parts of the world.
Yeah, and we're a U.S. domestic company, but one thing that struck me when you were talking is that from an infrastructure point of view, what's interesting about the 28 gigahertz band is people are looking at using it not just for reaching out to the customer, but also for backhaul and developing technologies that can do both. So with a single installation, you can actually do the backhaul component as well as the air interface to the customer, and obviate the need for fiber to these places. It's not it's not necessarily going to be used everywhere, but it just struck me as one of those things that whereas we might be looking at it in more rural deployments where you might not actually have access to fiber backhaul. It's just an interesting side note for what might be helpful in the African environment.
I agree, we have to be very humble when we start predicting things, but I think in many developing countries, smart city type applications are going to be big. Those of you who traveled, you recognize that a lot of things have changed very rapidly in cities in the developing world, traffic for one, but a lot of other things. And I think smart city type applications have great potential. They may all happen in the developed world first, but then low cost, appreciated solutions will appear quickly there. That's a guess on my part.
Any other questions from the audience? Not, I have more.
I don't know. Hi, Lamore Schaff from the TIA. I'm actually curious about the intelligence that's going to be built into the networks, because given the different variety of networks that are going to be built and how they're all going to have to communicate and how data is going to have to flow from one another, there's going to need to be intrinsic intelligence in the networks. And I was curious if anybody could speak to that.
Well, that's a big
Yes.
part of our 5G spiel at Intel, because we look at solving this end to end. There's going to be a lot more computing and going on, and of course that's one of our strengths, and I think we'll be looking to. When we think about 5G, we think of it entirely as an end-to-end solution. So I'm not going to predict exactly what's going to happen, but I think, again, every time you think about one of these new applications, you're going to be thinking about the data analytics that lie behind it. And that will be just one example.
But I think you're starting to see that now. I mean, a lot of carriers are deploying this network virtualization features in their networks to manage their resources more efficiently from a carriage to meet the service demands. So you're seeing this grow now already. But there will be certainly some new things. For example, in the phase array, that's a lot of intelligence itself. Now it's going to take a minute and follow you around the city as you're driving around. So there's going to be multiple aspects of this technology, but I think we're already seeing a lot of this in the current version of the networks.
So I hope to have a telecom panel at ITIF without talking about net neutrality, but it seems like you're not going to. But it seems to me if you have this sort of end-to-end solution, right, where there's incredible intelligence built into the network that can dynamically adapt resources depending on a particular application's need. So is that all just going to happen in a sort of economics-free environment, like no payment exchanges hands? And to what extent do these technologies run up against net neutrality? Can clever engineers, work within that framework or not? Anyone want to touch that one or?
Not with a 10-foot pole.
Second.
All right, that's fine. Any other questions from the audience? So I've got one more. If I can sort of play something of a skeptic, we've touched several times on how expensive infrastructure is going to be to deploy, and in a sort of a separate context, we've seen on wired networks, consumers are sort of hesitant to pay significantly more for a marginal increase in speed. If they're 50 megabits per second, to ask them to pay more for 100 megabits per second, not many people take that deal. And so if this is going to be so expensive and consumers seem to be already sort of maxed out on willingness to pay for their particular data plan, where is the money going to come from to build these networks? How do we make this economical to be able to deploy this sort of very expensive system?
Is
Is it going to happen?
Yeah, look, I think you pose a question that's always an issue. I mean, a lot of times one of the things we've been also sort of talking about is a lot of times the move from one generation to the next generation is a lot about technological efficiency. Certainly the move to 4G was that, and actually one of the things I was going to say earlier, what was interesting about the move to 4G, yes, it was technologically a more efficient technology, but we ran into this problem. It also made people want to use more. So it actually created a situation where we actually needed, greater access to spectrum, need to densify the networks, all the things that really are about economic efficiency, which is pretty much what you're saying. And to me, that incorporates technology. So if it turns out that you've got a technology that just isn't economically efficient, it will die by the wayside. It just won't work. But what we are finding, and I think it's, unfortunately I don't have the statistics in front of me, but the prices that we've been charging have been for increasingly larger amounts of data. And, we're also going to see, again, this is not just about consumer data in large bandwidths and low latency. This is about business, this is about IoT. So, I hesitate to say that, the consumers will wind up paying more, they'll wind up paying less. Remember what we were saying earlier, is consumers are now doing things with their phones that were several other pieces of their life before that they now do with their phones. So, I'm, in some ways I'm just not answering your question, and I think I'm choosing not to answer it, but, part of what we do as a company and part of what any network builder does as a company is you evaluate, you take risks, you take very long-term risks because you're actually, building out, and I shouldn't say very long-term, in our world it's like you're building out 18 months in advance and then you switch out of technology every, 5 years or so. And, your customers buy new phones, they're doing new things with it. Yeah, we could actually run into a situation where nobody wants any of this anymore, or that's not gonna happen, and we know that as I watch all of you sitting there looking at your devices. And that's a piece of this. This is actually, in some ways, taking from what is fixed to make it mobile, allowing, one of the things we didn't even talk about is allowing, in fact, greater competition in areas where, there may be only one fixed provider of broadband. And to date, we've all talked about wireless as sort of a competitor, but 5G puts you in a situation where, operators can come in and actually, in a fixed way, be, a competitor to a wireline broadband. So I think all the economics is just, again, in terms of predicting the future, I'm not very good at it, but I think to go back to an earlier era, I once, many years ago, was on a debate panel after PCS was, before it was even adopted, where everybody was like, well, this is the death of cellular. And I have a book back in my office from like 1992, Death of Cellular. And basically what happened is, and from a very well-known consulting company, basically what happened is it just expanded the market in a way that people were not thinking about it. They were looking in a linear way instead of looking in a holistic way. And I think, so I guess bottom line is that I'm unwilling to predict how it's going to unfold, but I think that there are a lot of different companies involved in this. We're putting a lot of different, irons in fire, and I predict that in 10 years there will be wireless networks doing 5G, and there will be people paying for it, but there may be ways for people to pay for it that are unthought of right now. So anyway, it's not very articulate. But,
Two quick thoughts. When you think about consumer willingness to pay, I think it's important to start with the notion of consumer surplus. So if you all thought, how much would I pay if I had to pay the last dollar that I'd be willing to pay to have my my broadband, wireless broadband? It would be a very large number. In fact, collectively for society, the economists have estimated it's basically 10 to 20 times the producer surplus or the auction revenues. So in the case of the DTV transition, we're talking consumer surplus on the order of $200 to $400 million. To me, that is a lot of willingness to pay. And if you think about the impact in 3G and the incredible changes that occurred, one of my all-time favorite factoids is if you go back to the introduction of the iPhone, at that time, the three big device manufacturers were RIM, BlackBerry, Nokia, and Motorola. Two of them have been sold for pennies on the dollar, and the other couldn't sell itself. So now that's the world we live in. And that's driven by the fact that people value those smartphones so much. And so if we have the same kind of excitement on 5G and it's integrated into business and society broadly, sky's the limit.
Yeah, so I mean, Doug, that is the key, that is a key question that you asked. And I mean, I just look at it this way, I don't I don't try to overcomplicate that. I mean, I just don't meet anyone who doesn't want better broadband. I mean, I don't necessarily say that I interact with, everyone around the world every single day, but I'm just have yet to meet anyone who doesn't want better broadband. Tomorrow I'll leave for my annual vacation to New Hampshire. I see the same folks every year up there. They know I'm in the wireless business. The first thing that they're going to say to me is, why isn't my connection better? So that, that just is the guiding principle here. But, the challenge to all of us on the technology side always is to make the technology so much better that it's such a leap to 5G, that it's so compelling, that it's so cost effective that, everyone can afford it and the folks who are deploying it can make a fair return. But I'm waiting to see the person who says, I don't want the new device. I actually, there's no retro in wireless. There's no one selling, the old versions. Everyone wants the new, coolest, best thing. But I agree with you. We got to keep that going, and that's why we got to make something that's really, really compelling and cost effective.
Check in. Any other questions from the audience? Anyone have anything come to mind? So I have a question for Peter. If you look like you wanted to jump in.
No, I was getting ready to leave.
I was gonna ask one more for the equipment guys. I'm curious to hear more about the software impact on the equipment business. It seems like when much more of the functionality is moving to virtualized systems running in software, that has to have an impact on how you run the equipment business, right? To what extent is that shift a challenge or an opportunity? Tom, you made it sound like ZTE is out there ready and willing to virtualize a lot of its products.
Yes, you're right. I think this software virtualization is, cannot be avoided, definitely, even for 4G as of today, because the purpose is try to help the operators to reduce the costs on their network side. The software defined network is the only solution to dramatically reduce the cost for the operation of the network and also the capex of the networks, especially for the new generations like 5Gs.
Samsung is in a very similar situation. We're supportive of these features being rolled out, the software features being rolled out, because it does, one, give us opportunity to sell new boxes to the carriers, but two, gives them the opportunity to more efficiently operate their systems and make precious decisions on how they're going to use this precious resource they've bought. And they want to get the most out of that, and I think this is one way to do that.
All right, with that, I'll gratify Peter in calling this done. It sounds like we did not actually need to extend the panel. All right, if you'll all join me in thanking the panelists for